Anti-Nuclear Protests by Sanderson Beck. Protesting Nuclear Testing. In April 1954, India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru led the non-aligned nations in criticizing the U.S. H-bomb tests in the Pacific. He also encouraged Norman Cousins to persuade Albert Schweitzer to alert the world to the dangers of nuclear weapons and their testing. In the summer of 1957, Nevil Shute's novel On the Beach about survivors of a nuclear war was published, and Republican Senator Wayne Morris of Oregon introduced a resolution to halt nuclear tests because of their radiation hazards, but also as a first step toward disarmament and peace. On July 15, 1955, the Maynow Declaration, signed by 52 Nobel laureates, warned humanity all nations must come to the decision to renounce force as a final resort of policy. If they are not prepared to do this, they will cease to exist. On May 15, 1957, Dr. Linus Pauling referred to Schweitzer's appeal when he spoke at Washington University in St. Louis, arguing that no human being should be sacrificed to a project that could kill hundreds of millions. Two other professors, Barry Commoner and Edward Condon, helped Pauling write a petition that garnered signatures from 2,000 scientists by June, when it was released to the press and sent to the White House. Pauling had won a Nobel Prize for chemistry, but he gave up his administrative position at Caltech in 1958 to write the book No More War, that warned against the harmful effects of radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons testing. In the preface, he wrote, "We shall enter upon the continuing period of peace, a period when there will be no more war, when disputes between nations will be settled by the application of man's power of reason by international law. It is the development of great nuclear weapons that requires that war be given up for all time. The forces that can destroy the world must not be used." Pauling described what hydrogen bombs would do to major cities and predicted that the fallout from testing could result in 1 million seriously defective children and about 2 million embryonic and neonatal deaths. He proposed a World Peace Research Organization and sent 1,500 copies of the book to influential people, including every member of Congress. In July 1957, Bertrand Russell had initiated the Pugwash Conference that brought together scientists from both sides of the Cold War. This was so successful that it became the first of a series of conferences. On January 15, 1958, Pauling handed United Nations Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld a petition signed by 9,235 scientists, including 37 Nobel laureates, urging an international agreement to stop testing. Inspired by Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott of 1956 and the Catholic workers and war resistors who had refused to take shelter during civil defense drills in New York, some activists formed the Committee for Nonviolent Action, CNVA. On August 12, 1957, they held vigils at the office of the Atomic Energy Commission in Las Vegas, Nevada. When they tried to enter the gates of the atomic test site at Camp Mercury, they were arrested for trespassing. After they received suspended sentences, they returned to a prayer vigil at the test site and saw the extraordinary light of the first test in a series. The next spring, Albert Bigelow and 4 Quakers sailed the Golden Rule into the Pacific Test Zone near the Eniwetok Atoll, where H-bomb tests were planned. They defied a court injunction twice, were arrested, and went to jail. Hearing of their trial, Earl Reynolds sailed his Phoenix into the test zone and spent 2 days in jail. In the summer of 1959, CNVA activists organized civil disobedience in Omaha at the Strategic Air Command SAC base. Others held a vigil to protest the germ warfare at Fort Detrick in Maryland, and the Polaris submarine was picketed in Connecticut. For 10 months, starting in December 1960, a walk for peace traversed from San Francisco to the East Coast, through Europe and on to Moscow. Also, in 1957, the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, SANE, was founded. The name was suggested by psychologist Erich Fromm, and the main organizers were longtime Executive Secretary of the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, Clarence Pickett, and the United World Federalist, UWF, Norman Cousins, editor of Saturday Review. Unitarian minister Homer Jack became coordinator. After Sputnik was launched on October 4th, their full-page advertisement in the New York Times warned people, "We are facing a danger unlike any danger that has ever existed." The ad was then run in many local papers, and 25,000 reprints were distributed. SANE ran a series of effective ads, including one which said, "Dr. Spock is worried," featuring the famous pediatrician Benjamin Spock, whose book, Baby and Child Care, was extraordinarily influential. Within a year, SANE had 25,000 members in 130 chapters. On May 19, 1958, Madison Square Garden in New York was filled with 20,000 supporters. In July, President Eisenhower offered to stop nuclear testing on October 31st for 1 year, provided that the Soviet Union also refrained from testing during this moratorium, though the U.S. did conduct a series of tests in October. In 1959, negotiations for a test ban bogged down at Geneva because the Soviets feared that on-site inspections by the United States would be used for spying. The Student Peace Union was started at the University of Chicago by CNVA activist Kenneth Calkins, and they adopted the logo of the British Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, based on the semaphore signs for N and D in a circle that became the universally recognized peace symbol. After tensions in Germany over the building of the Berlin Wall in August 1961, the Soviets resumed nuclear testing on September 1st. 2 weeks later, the United States began testing underground, but in April 1962, the United States resumed testing in the atmosphere. The effort to stop nuclear testing was greatly enhanced by the actions of Women's Strike for Peace, WSP, starting in the fall of 1961. In 1963, SANE urged its members to write to the Senate and White House, and 18,000 letters were sent asking for an end to nuclear testing. Norman Cousins consulted with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and flew to Moscow to talk with Soviet Premier Khrushchev about a test ban treaty. After Cousins returned and advised President Kennedy that the Russians would respond favorably to a diplomatic initiative, Kennedy included the proposal in his speech at the American University in June 1963. By the end of July, the partial test ban treaty had been signed by the two superpowers. However, the French continued to test nuclear weapons in the South Pacific. Between 1972 and 1974, Greenpeace's Rainbow Warrior made a series of voyages to the Mururoa and Fangataufa atolls in order to disrupt the tests. After French gendarmes beat Greenpeace crew member David McTaggart on the Vega, the outrage to the publicity was so vociferous that the French decided to move their tests underground also. Greenpeace has continued with many creative actions to protest nuclear weapons. In July 1985, when France was about to resume nuclear testing, its secret agents bombed the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbor, killing a crew member. Rainbow Warrior 2 returned to Mururoa and was seized by the French. Greenpeace's Nuclear Free Seas campaign started in 1987 and got results 4 years later when Britain, Russia, and the United States all withdrew their nuclear weapons from onboard surface ships. In 1995, the French seized the Rainbow Warrior 2 and arrested the crew prior to more testing. but international outrage persuaded them to stop testing there after January 1996. That year, several Greenpeace executive directors were arrested in Tiananmen Square for protesting China's nuclear testing. Since 2000, Greenpeace has been protesting the testing of the U.S. Ballistic Missile Defense (BMD) tests at Vandenberg Air Force Base and the Kwajalein Atoll. Nonviolent protests began at the underground nuclear test site at Mercury, Nevada in 1981. Numbers of those getting arrested were small until 1986, when 775 protested and 154 were arrested. From then until 1994, there were 536 American peace test demonstrations at the Nevada test site, with a total of 37,488 participants with 15,740 arrests. After 1994, the American Peace Test disbanded, but the faith-based Nevada Desert Experience, NDE, continued to protest every year. Protesting nuclear power. Demonstrations against nuclear power plants in Western Europe began in France and West Germany in 1971. Protests increased, and in February 1975, a major breakthrough for the anti-nuclear movement occurred in Weil of southwestern Germany. When construction of the power plant was about to begin, several hundred local activists, farmers, housewives, merchants, and students held a press conference at the construction site and sat down in front of the bulldozers. Police cleared the area by using water cannons and by arresting people. Nevertheless, some local people stayed there overnight, and they returned the next week with 28,000 supporters from all over Germany and from Alsace in France. People occupied the land for over a year and operated a school to educate people on nuclear issues. They agreed to leave when a panel of judges was established, and in 1977 the panel ruled against the plant. During the summer of 1976, the construction site for a nuclear power plant at Seabrook, New Hampshire, was occupied by 180 people, and the following April, more than 2,000 members of the Clamshell Alliance marched onto the site where construction had begun. On the 1st of May, 1,414 people were arrested at the Seabrook site. The clams were well organized into affinity groups of 10 to 20 people who were trained in nonviolence and practiced consensus decision-making. They attempted to avoid a hierarchical and authoritarian leadership structure by letting every person in each group and each group within the whole participate in the process. Of those arrested, more than half refused to pay bail and stayed in custody for 2 weeks. The example of the Clamshell Alliance stimulated a more active resistance in California to the almost completed Diablo Canyon nuclear reactors. The Movement for a New Society, MNS, from Philadelphia, had influenced the clamshell, and David Hartsoe, who had also worked for civil rights in the South, brought their nonviolence tactics, affinity group structure, and consensus processes to California, persuading the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, board to support the Diablo Canyon action in order to develop the nonviolent movement. In June 1977, the Abalone Alliance was formed. The Mothers for Peace had filed as interveners in 1973 and were glad to see the effort mobilizing. Nonviolence was strictly adhered to when 47 people were arrested for trespassing on August 7, 1977. 1 year later, 5,000 people rallied, and 487 occupiers and blockaders were arrested for their civil disobedience. By the time fuel loading was due to begin in September 1981, a nonviolence handbook had been published to educate new activists on the processes. Numerous affinity groups were prepared from all over California, and the direct action was extended for 2 weeks with more than 1,900 arrests. Shortly after the action, numerous errors were discovered in the plans and buildings of the plant. and 2 years later the plant was still not close to becoming operational. Although a minor earthquake fault was found near the plant, it eventually did go online. For many people, including myself, the experience at Diablo Canyon in the encampment, the nonviolence training, the affinity group friendship, feminist awareness, the consensus processes, the arrest, and the time together in jail were deeply moving and inspiring. The nonviolence code, which was agreed to by every affinity group, was as follows. 1. Our attitude will be one of openness, friendliness, and respect toward all people we encounter. 2. We will use no violence, verbal or physical, toward any person. 3. We will not damage any property. 4. We will not bring or use any drugs or alcohol other than for medical purposes. 5. We will not run. 6. We will carry no weapons. These nonviolence guidelines were adopted by various direct actions in California, sponsored by the Livermore Action Group, the Vandenberg Action Coalition, and others. At Diablo Canyon in 1981, strong solidarity was achieved on refusing to pay any money for bail or fines, and also on refusing to accept probation. Most people were released after 4 days for time served, but over 500 people became defendants represented by Richard Frischman using the necessity argument that people had to act out of a moral necessity in order to prevent a greater harm or danger. This defensive necessity has been used by many anti-nuclear activists in order to challenge these evils through the judicial process. During my week in jail, I got to know the white-haired Berkeley Bob Schneider, who had won the Silver Star in World War II and later became known as Eldred. He told me that this Diablo Canyon action was so fantastic that he wanted to help organize the same thing at the Livermore Laboratory in Northern California, where research for nuclear weapons is conducted. I agreed that the danger of nuclear weapons is even greater than that of nuclear power. In February 1982, the Livermore Action Group had their first action, and on June 21st of that year, 1,400 blockaders, including Daniel Ellsberg, disrupted business as usual at the lab and were arrested. That same month, 1,691 blockaded the United Nations offices of the nuclear weapons powers, and nearly 1 million people marched in the streets of New York for an end to the nuclear arms race. Protesting nuclear weapons. The people in the long run are going to do more to promote peace than our government. Indeed, I think that people want peace so much that one of these days government better get out of the way and let them have it. Dwight Eisenhower, 1959. In the name of God, let us abolish nuclear weapons. New Abolitionist Covenant. We reject violence completely because the structural violence caused by this decision to place these missiles or to continue the arms race on both sides is violence. Petra Kelly. We must protest if we are to survive. Protest is the only realistic form of civil defense. E.P. Thompson. In June 1978, the United Nations held its first special session on disarmament, and a coalition called the Mobilization for Survival, MFS, sponsored a rally of 20,000 protesters. That year, hundreds of people had been arrested over a period of 8 months at Rocky Flats, Colorado, where the plutonium triggers for nuclear bombs are manufactured. Daniel Ellsberg called Rocky Flats the Auschwitz of our time. The next year, 15,000 people participated in the demonstrations at Rocky Flats. In April 1979, at Groton, Connecticut, more than 3,000 people demonstrated, and over 200 people blockaded the launching of the first Trident submarine, the Ohio. On September 9, 1980, Daniel Berrigan, Philip Berrigan, Dean Hammer, Elmer Moss, Carl Cabot, Anne Montgomery, Molly Rush, and John Schuchard of the Plowshares 8 entered a General Electric plant in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, and hammered on Mark 12A nuclear warheads, a first-strike weapon for the MX missile. During their trial, they were not allowed to present evidence on international law or the defense of necessity, but were convicted of burglary, conspiracy, and criminal mischief, and were sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. They were defended by Ramsey Clark and others, and their appeals took 10 years. Their trial is depicted in the movie In the King of Prussia, with Martin Sheen playing the judge and the defendants playing themselves. Their disarmament action was followed by many other plowshare actions at General Dynamics Electric Boatyard in Croton, Connecticut, protesting the Trident submarines, and at other facilities where nuclear weapons are developed, or at missile silos, ELF, extremely low-frequency towers used for communications during a nuclear war, or at military bases. Starting in 1984, some judges began to allow juries to hear expert evidence based on justification by necessity and to uphold international law. As of 1986, 17 of these disarmament actions had taken place, with some sentences as long as 12 years. And by the year 2001, there had been 68 plowshares actions involving 150 individuals, many of whom committed more than one action. The average sentences have been between 1 and 2 years. In October 2002, 3 Dominican sisters hammered on a Minuteman missile silo near Greeley, Colorado. After a trial, they were sentenced to 41, 33, and 30 months, a $3,080 fine, and 3 years probation. Plowshares actions have also taken place in Australia, Germany, Holland, Sweden, England, and Ireland. The conversion of 2 Catholic bishops, Mathieson in Amarillo, Texas, and Hunthausen of Seattle, was stimulated by personal contact with individuals arrested for civil disobedience. Mathieson urged workers to quit Pantex, where nuclear weapons are assembled, and Hunthausen refused to pay part of his federal income tax to protest military spending. Jim and Shelley Douglas, who influenced Bishop Hunthausen in Washington, organized a group called Ground Zero, which began protesting Trident submarines in 1975, and, starting in 1983, the White Train carrying nuclear weapons. Their dual focus in their nonviolent civil disobedience campaign is Christ's kingdom of God and international law. The Los Angeles Catholic workers, who operate a free soup kitchen on Skid Row to feed about 800 people a day, have been active in civil disobedience for several years, protesting nuclear weapons businesses in Southern California, and also other wars since then. Following in Dorothy Day's tradition, Jeff Dietrich, Catherine Morris, and others have been arrested many times. The planned flight testing of the MX missile at Vandenberg Air Force Base on the central coast of California brought protesters from all over the state in January and March of 1983. About 200 were arrested and banned from the base in the first action. Many of these people returned in March and were joined by hundreds more who stayed in jail a week in solidarity for equal sentences. In the second action, 777 were arrested. Congress had delayed some of the MX missile funds, which were to be voted on again in May. That month, Jim Wallace of the Sojourners led 242 Christians into the halls of the U.S. Congress to pray. They were arrested for an illegal demonstration. On June 17th, the first MX missile flight test was delayed for several days at Vandenberg as 40 protesters were arrested on the base. The Vandenberg Action Coalition is just one of the many activist groups that have sprung up around the world. Since the missile flights are targeted at the Marshall Islands, these protests are connected to the efforts of Pacific Islanders for a nuclear-free Pacific. The first flight test of the MX missile seems to have been scheduled to coincide with the first annual International Day of Nuclear Disarmament on June 20, 1983, organized by the Livermore Action Group, LAG, of Berkeley. On that day, legal rallies and nonviolent civil disobedience occurred in over 50 locations across the United States. At Livermore alone, 1,066 people were arrested. Most of them refused to be arraigned because they would not accept probation. After a week, the judge relented on the probation. The objectives of this action were to further the causes of global nuclear disarmament, demilitarization and non-intervention, equitable distribution of wealth and resources within and among nations, and a sustainable relationship between the human race and the planet. The aim was to protest, halt, and disrupt the design, production, transport, and deployment of nuclear weapons worldwide for at least one working day. In August 1981, some women in England organized a march from Cardiff to the U.S. Air Force Base at Greenham Common, 125 miles away, in order to protest the planned deployment of 96 cruise missiles there. Because it flies low so as not to be picked up by radar, the cruise missile is considered a first-strike weapon rather than a deterrent. The marchers arrived at Greenham Common on September 5th. The media had ignored the march, so 4 women chained themselves to the main gate. Many decided to stay and set up a peace camp on base property. They were soon joined by others. On January 20th, 1982, the nearby town of Newbury threatened to evict them, but they decided to remain and wanted to encourage the Labour Party, which was currently considering unilateral disarmament. That year, it became a peace camp for women only. The evictions began in May 1982, but those arrested were soon replaced by others as they had a decentralized social structure. Following the example of the U.S. Women's Pentagon action, they issued a call to surround the base. On December 12, 1982, more than 30,000 women did exactly that, and the next day, about 2,000 women were arrested for blockading the base. On New Year's Day, 1983, 44 women climbed over the fence and danced on a partially built missile silo. The women named the 7 gates of the Greenham Common base after the colors of the rainbow. Inspired by the encirclement, many towns and cities formed Greenham groups and supported the peace camp by raising money, spreading publicity, and arranging child care and transportation. Local affinity groups were able to initiate their own actions and be independent while still being part of the movement. After the cruise missiles were deployed in November 1983, a group of women decided to file a lawsuit in New York against President Reagan. The court denied them a hearing, but the effort created an extensive network in the United States. Another independent action that was opposed by many in the camp was when London Greenham groups brought blankets to the fences. In December 1983, about 40,000 women came to Greenham Common with mirrors to reflect back the reality of the base to those inside. During a 10-day action in September 1984, about 10,000 women camped at the base. That month, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher announced that she would get rid of the camp, and after that, evictions occurred almost every day. Military bylaws were imposed in April 1985, making trespass a criminal offense with a possible fine of £100 or 28 days in prison. The U.S. Air Force even zapped women with microwaves of ultrasound that silently interfered with brainwave patterns, causing headaches, drowsiness, loss of memory, and even worse symptoms. On December 12, 1985, the 6th anniversary of the NATO decision to deploy cruise missiles, actions were carried out in home areas as well as at the base. Cruise Watch monitored the 44 deployments that occurred at the base between 1984 and 1988, so that missiles could not be deployed outside the base in secret. The women believed that these convoys were enough to cause the Soviet Union to go on nuclear alert because an exercise could not be distinguished from a real threat. In 1987, women at the camp debated who could call themselves Greenham women, some believing that only those at the camp should do so. All these and many other decisions were made by using consensus process. In her articles, Gwynne Kirk described the feminist and nonviolent practices of the Greenham women, whom she believed practiced nonviolence as a way of life. She described the 6 principles as assertiveness, challenging the police, politicians, judges, and the military; enjoyment, celebrating and affirming life with power, creativity, and imagination; openness, making the business of war public and having clear communication; support and preparation, providing for the needs of the blockaders; flexibility of tactics, responding to new situations and being creatively unpredictable to keep up the pressure; and resistance, maintaining the protest despite harassment, prosecution, and persecution. The values she observed that the experience at Greenham Common used and taught are personal responsibility, not being victims and initiating actions; diversity, the variety of people and overcoming racism; a decentralized network, friendly groups providing emotional support; non-hierarchical decision-making, feminist and consensus processes; communication, coordination, and continuity by personal contacts; and flexibility. Many women at Greenham Common found that their experience was transformative, and the peace camp there lasted until the year 2000. Inspired by their example, many other peace camps sprang up in such places as Cosimo in Sicily, Seneca in New York, Puget Sound, Savannah River, St. Paul, and in Holland and Australia. At the Seneca Women's Peace Camp, the attributes of responsibility, self-discipline, cooperation, and struggle were emphasized, and the consensus process was closely followed. In West Germany, the anti-nuclear and ecology movements grew into a full-fledged political party, the Greens. They managed to combine direct action protests with electoral politics, and in March 1983, the Green Party won 27 seats in the national parliament. As their most articulate spokesperson in English, Petra Kelly pointed out that one of their main concerns was the U.S. deployment of Pershing II and cruise missiles in Western Europe that was scheduled to begin in December 1983. Kelly argued that nonviolent action and parliamentary democracy are complementary, writing, "Nonviolent opposition in no way diminishes or undermines representative democracy. In fact, it strengthens and stabilizes it. The will of the electorate is not expressed simply by putting one's mark on a political blank check every 4 years." Petra Kelly believed that the Greens must demonstrate how to resolve conflicts by not treating adversaries as enemies, but as people who need to be liberated from their slavery to violence. Practically every violent action results in violence in return. Thus, violent revolutions usually only change the personnel at the top, but the system of violence remains. Like Gandhi, she recommended not cooperating with the violent elements in the social system. The anti-nuclear movement is active throughout Western Europe, while in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, it primarily operated through official organizations. In the Netherlands, the No Cruise Missiles Committee organized massive rallies with 400,000 people in Amsterdam in November 1981, and 550,000 in The Hague in October 1983. An anti-missile petition was signed in 1985 by 3.75 million Dutch citizens. In England, more than a dozen peace camps were established, Greenham Common being the most well-known. European nuclear disarmament, END, under the leadership of E.P. Thompson, grew quickly in a few years. The nonviolent direct action portion of the anti-nuclear movement emphasizes the egalitarian methods of shifting roles and leadership positions so that many people can develop leadership skills. Most protesters shy away from the word leader, preferring the role names of facilitator or spokesperson. Feminist awareness and consensus process attempt to be sensitive to every person's feelings, and the effort is always to keep a sense of group unity by resolving dissension. Yet every person in each group is considered autonomous. One group or even one person in a group can block consensus if there is an ethical objection to an action. Actually, it is a moral responsibility to protest an immoral action which may affect the group. This is in reality the basis of civil disobedience toward a society which is allowing immoral actions. As with Gandhi, people in the nonviolent movement feel that the means is as important as the end. Therefore, a great emphasis is placed on the purity of the process. When affinity groups of 5 to 20 people all agree on something, and when a spokes council of representatives from those groups all achieve a unanimous decision involving hundreds of people, the moral and spiritual power of the resulting action can be awesome. Through this process of alternating spokes council and affinity group meetings, goals are determined, strategies and tactics develop and change, and virtually every decision important to the group is made in such a way that every individual can influence the result. The Great Peace March of 1986 showed how many peace groups made a transition from the top-down organization that typifies political campaigns of leaders to a more democratic movement that is shaped by all the active participants. Initiated by the former campaign manager David Mixner, the publicity failed to produce the 5,000 marchers and funding support the staff of 100 expected. The march began from Los Angeles on March 1st with about 1,200 marching. The lack of organization resulted in numerous problems, and on March 14th, Mixner announced that the march was broke, had failed, and people might as well go home. At Barstow in the Mojave Desert, about 400 people decided that they would continue and appealed for assistance. Renamed the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament, on March 28th they continued walking as a reformed democratic organization on the move, Peace City. They found support along the way, and by the time they reached Washington, D.C. on November 15th, they were about 800 strong. Those who persisted found that they had the most challenging and memorable experiences of their lives. Other protests of nuclear weapons continued to occur throughout the 1980s. For example, Pax Christi sponsored a protest of the Trident II submarine base at Kings Bay, Georgia on May 6, 1989. After a short rally, 54 people were given traffic citations for blocking the road into the main gate. Then 20 of us were arrested on the federal property of the base for stepping over a designated line on the sidewalk outside the fence of the base, and were later charged with a federal petty offense. When the Berlin Wall came down 7 months later, I was still in prison for having a trial in that action. But it was clear that the direct actions protesting nuclear weapons were rapidly diminishing as the Soviet Union collapsed and was transformed by the end of the Cold War.